Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm going to wait 1 minute because we just started to let everyone get in the room. Now it is 3:30. All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. Happy to have you at our last regular session of the day and our last featured speaker of the summit. We're really excited to have her. I'm Sarah, as you probably know, and I'm Habitat Project Coordinator for a Partnership for Delaware Estuary. If you have any general questions during this session or tech problems, please put them in the chat and our tech help people will reach out to you with an answer. Please be aware that all of our sessions are being recorded and then all the chat threads will be saved and shared later after the summit. We're going to just wait for all questions till the end of the presentation today. So put all your questions in the Q&A box, but you're also welcome to use the raise hand feature and speak with our speaker if you'd like at the end. Kurt Chang from PDE will be moderating those questions. All right, now I'm going to throw it over to Danielle Krieger, PDE's Science Director, to introduce our speaker.
Great, thanks, Sarah. Well, I'm just delighted to introduce our speaker for this afternoon, a plenary speaker, Dr. Kelsey Leonard. Dr. Leonard is an assistant professor at the University of Waterloo, and she represents the Shinnecock Indian Nation on the Mid-Atlantic Committee on the Ocean, which is charged with protecting America's coastal ecosystems and oceanic resources. She also serves as a member of the Great Lakes Water Quality Board of the International Joint Commission. Dr. Leonard's background, she received an AB with honors from Harvard University, a master's from the University of Oxford, a JD from Duquesne University, and her doctorate was from McMaster University. And her doctoral dissertation examined how indigenous water governance in the Great Lakes, how those resources could be protected. A very prestigious postdoctoral award in Canada, the Banting Postdoctoral Fellowship. Dr. Leonard has been instrumental in safeguarding the interests of Indigenous nations for environmental planning, building Indigenous science and knowledge into new solutions for water governance and sustainable oceans. And her recent scholarship explores legal personhood for water. And her TED Talk, Why Lakes and Rivers Should Have the Same Rights as Humans, has nearly 3 million views. And anecdotally, I just wanted to add that long before we started planning the summit, this TED Talk went viral around our own office at PDE, and staff just couldn't stop talking about it. And so we thought, in particular, given our focus on water resources in this watershed, and some of the societal shifts and paradigm shifts that we're seeing in the nation, that this is an especially timely plenary speaker that we can invite. And we were just delighted that she would agree to do it. So with no further ado, let me introduce Dr. Leonard.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I'm happy to be joining you all today. And I hear that you've been having a really wonderful summit and experience so far. So I am glad to also be contributing towards the conversation. So I'm just going to take a moment to share my screen with you. So everyone should now be seeing my screen. Staff can let me know if there's any technical difficulties. But my presentation today is on Indigenous climate resiliency in the Mid-Atlantic region. So I will be touching on more broadly shared experiences throughout the Eastern Atlantic coast for Indigenous nations in this part of the world. But I also wanted to center our conversation particularly within the Mid-Atlantic and within the Delaware River, Delaware Bay estuary region. So I thought we might start by just having everyone orient themselves, introduce themselves. I should flag if there's a chat feature available or not. I apologize, we didn't check on that. But if there is, and you're able to navigate to your chat feature, if not, that's okay. But I would love for folks to kind of introduce yourself and the land that you are now living, residing, and occupying. So for myself, I am from the Shinnecock Nations. I'm an enrolled citizen of our tribal nation, which is located on the eastern end of what's currently known as Long Island, New York. But I am zooming in today from my work location of Ontario, Canada, on Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe territories. So this mapping tool that I have on the slide here, native-land.ca, is a really great tool. It's constantly being updated, so a caveat that not all of the information may always be super accurate, but it is really come leaps and bounds in trying to make sure that the information is as accurate as possible. And that link has just been added into the chat box for attendees. You can go there and you're able to type in your city, your zip code. You can even use the zoom feature and scale down to the region that you are calling home or working from or zooming in from today, and share that with us through the chat box. Or just, if you want to keep it personal to yourself, that's okay too. But I think it is really important in these conversations around water governance, around understanding our relationship to water, both in freshwater and ocean ecosystems, to know about the folks and the communities that have stewarded these territories for thousands of years in what we now know as North America. We have a lot of folks that are saying Lenni Lenape, which is great. Some folks are zooming in from Narragansett territory, which is great. You may find some of today's session very illuminating for as we pull from some of the work that the Narragansett folks have been doing. Lenni Lenape, Nanticoke, great. Munsee Lenape, Susquehannock, yeah, Chesapeake and Nansemond. And what you'll also note from this map as well is it gives you traditional territory spatial orientations, but then you can sort of zoom in further or do further research to determine what state recognized tribes or federally recognized tribes and other indigenous communities, maybe an urban Indian center if you're zooming in from a city, that may be representative of the indigenous population in your community and places that you work. Yeah, great things are coming in. And so if we look at Delaware and particularly this part of the world and the work that brings us all here through the Science Summit, you can see here on the right-hand side, we sort of have a map of the watershed and the basin. And over on the left-hand side, we sort of have that zoomed in location on the nativeland.ca map. And you can see, again, you are very much sort of in the traditional territories of Nanticoke, Lenni Lenape, Susquehannock, Munsee. We're a little bit cut off on the map there, but we're there if you're sort of peeking out at Long Island and Shinnecock. And so what you will notice from my talk today and why this map is so illustrative is, well, one, on the map on the right, Indigenous nations were not even listed anymore. Our languages are still very present from the different types of nomenclature that are used for various rivers, streams, creeks, tributaries of the watershed, and the Delaware itself being named after the Delaware people. So that is still very present, but our governments, our locations of our communities, our territorial boundaries are no longer present. And that's really important when we start to think about what does water governance and climate adaptation look like for the basin, and really trying to be inclusive of diverse knowledge systems that exist within the basin to advance our shared sustainable futures. And so that is probably at the heart of our conversation today, and what I hope you will take away from today is how do we build more sustainable partnerships so that we have an enhanced capacity for climate adaptation and resiliency that is inclusive of the diverse communities that now share this part of the world. And I believe wholeheartedly that that foundation of those knowledge systems and of those partnerships should be with Indigenous peoples, those who still currently live and exist and thrive in the basin, and also those tribes such as the different Lenape and Delaware tribes that were forcibly removed through historical wrong committed against those communities by the United States federal government and other colonial apparatuses that then led to their forced relocation outside of the basin. And yet they still have strong historical ties to the basin and strong Indigenous knowledge and scientific practice that could inform and should inform the ways in which we're thinking about conservation and stewardship and water governance for the protection of the basin and protection of human and social indicators moving forward. So I come to this work both as a citizen from the basin, an American citizen, and also a citizen of my tribal nation, very familiar in having lived in the basin, also at one point in my life, living in Philadelphia and being a consumer of drinking water from the basin. And so there is a strong affinity and also a strong closeness that as an Indigenous person from the region, there are some shared knowledge systems and shared practices, conservation practices that I really want to draw out today for you. And I also do that in another aspect of my work, not only through scientific research, but through my role as a policy leader within spaces of regional ocean planning. So the map that I have here for you is the Mid-Atlantic Ocean Data Portal, which I hope that generally a lot of our data centers on offshore ocean resources, but there is quite a bit of data that does include nearshore estuarian environments, inclusive of the Delaware Bay. And what I like about this map is that also the previous map sort of showed you spatial plots of different territorial regions historically and contemporaneously for tribal nations. But this map also shows you our tribal government headquarters. So the green dots are the different tribal government headquarters. And you can see here that there are 4 state recognized tribes with a connection to the basin, live within the basin, and likely with strong traditional knowledge, traditional ecological knowledge ties to understanding conservation and stewardship practices in the basin. And those 4 state recognized tribes, that also is not inclusive of the federally recognized tribes that now are in various places, including states like Oklahoma, and as well as also where I am now located in Southern Ontario, which are sort of the fragmented communities that were forcibly relocated of the Delaware and Lenape nations. So they also still have really keen intuitive knowledge around conservation applicable to the basin based on oral tradition that has been handed down over thousands of years. And that is also based on a lot of observational data, which is really important and integral as we start to think about climate adaptation and resiliency. So for folks that may not, we are from the East, but if you're not familiar with Shinnecock, a lot of folks are unfortunately not familiar with the fact that there are tribal nations located on Long Island too, in fact, the Uncochaug-Puspatic Nation and also Shinnecock Nation, which I'm from. And you can sort of see here the portion in purple is our existing territory, but originally, prior to colonization, it would have been the large portion of the east end of Long Island, from about sort of Moriches Bay to East Hampton. But through practices of colonization, encroachment, usurpation of land, we are now sort of reduced to a portion of land located in Hampton Bays, and then our, which we call Westwoods, and then our current, our additional territory, which is sort of our main reservation on the Shinnecock Neck, which is bordered by the town of Southampton. So today I want to talk with you a little bit about our changing climate and how that's impacting tribes. look at particularly the impact of sea level rise as an extreme climate occurrence. We also will travel through some Indigenous adaptation measures that are currently underway and give you some insight into the diverse pluralistic knowledge systems that exist in the basin that aren't really always talked about. And then lastly, we will round out with some new tools for resilient futures. So I am a really big fan of this quote by former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. I feel that it really informs a lot of my scientific research as well as my understanding from a policy perspective. Climate change does not respect borders. It does not respect who you are, rich and poor, small and big. Therefore, this is what we call global challenges, which require global solidarity. And I think in a lot of ways, what I try to bring to the forefront through illustrating the innovations of Indigenous nations in the space of climate adaptation is that we are, in many instances, the miner's canary. We are already on the front lines of climate change, facing real impacts already due to climatic changes, including sea level rise. And so the innovations that we are developing right now in real time are going to be innovations that other communities can learn from now and will learn from in the future as you start to experience these same frontline climate change impacts. So this is a map of Long Island, and you can see here just some of the traditional knowledge. We have a very close affinity to whales as Shinnecock people, also having a traditional practice of hunting and harvesting whales. That is no longer carried out due to the decimation of the whale population due to industrial whaling in the early part of the late part of the 1800s, early part of the 1900s. And so what we have seen though for our Long Island community is a lot of environmental challenges and environmental degradation. And I think I raise these because it brings to call why I am centered in this work, why I'm passionate about this work. And I also think there's probably some similarities with what you are facing as well in the Delaware Basin. So, you know, this is a New York Times article, Dead Rivers, Closed Beaches, a Water Crisis on Long Island, really highlighting a lot of the impacts that we are having due to nitrogen overload, eutrophication, particularly because of our reliance on septic systems. We also are seeing a lot, many fish die-offs and different types of species die-offs. We also, we had crab die-offs. We had this one, which was impacting our Peconic Bay. The fish suffocated due to an algae outbreak that depleted the water of oxygen. Again, this was likely attributed to septic systems and nitrogen pollution, something that you are also probably very familiar with in your part of the Mid-Atlantic. We also have been seeing unusual mortality events. So our whale relatives have been severely impacted, particularly the North Atlantic right whale. The population is really being decimated by these unusual mortality events, and they are ongoing. I believe UME will still be declared for 2021. So we are seeing that our whale relatives are in distress, and this will become really important as we go through the rest of my presentation, that for us as Indigenous peoples, these different instances of climatic changes and environmental challenges are strong indicators for us of a depleting environmental health, depleting ecosystem health, and also potentially getting to the point of a threshold that we cannot recover from. So we are utilizing these indicators to really chart a course for adaptation and resiliency building. In the same way for the North Atlantic right whale, we also had a UME declared for humpback whales. And so one area in which I wanted to highlight today with you is particularly around sea level rise. And so we know that the earlier instances that I showed you of environmental warnings that our more than human relations are bringing to us are hearkening to much larger problems our planet is facing, and we as humans on this planet will also face. And in for tribal nations along the Atlantic coast, many of us are already facing these impacts. So this is, as I mentioned earlier, the neck, the main territory of our Shinnecock Nation. This is it currently. We already have many issues around saltwater intrusion, impacts to water infrastructure due to saltwater intrusion, storm surge. Like many of you, Hurricane Sandy was particularly devastating for our community, and the level of erosion that occurred and inundation after that extreme storm event has, really made us aware of the continued potential for sea level rise to decimate our community. And so this is the neck right now, but with existing sea level model predictions, as I believe you've had quite a few sea level rise sessions earlier today, so I won't go into too much detail, but we know that the model predictions are showing that in a worst case scenario, by 2100, we could have 6 feet or more of sea level rise. And so what that would look like for us at Shinnecock is this. So that pretty much means, and it's not just us, that's a big part of what this conversation today is about. As tribal nations, we are, again, that miner's canary. So we're trying in a lot of ways to not only build adaptation innovations that we can share with others for that global solidarity that Secretary Moon mentioned, but also to illustrate that what is befalling us right now is coming very soon, if not immediately, to other communities around the world. And so this is what our community will look like by 2100 with a 6-foot sea level rise. So in a lot of ways, that's about half of our reservation being inundated permanently, and left sort of unusable or not usable for population growth or human terrestrial use or other more than human species terrestrial use, but would be, again, sort of impacted and submerged. So what do we do about that? And I wasn't really seeing anything out in the literature that really highlighted what tribal nations are currently doing to adapt in instances of sea level rise. And in particular, where if we weren't being highlighted, I was looking to see, okay, what adaptation frameworks are available out in the scientific research that are inclusive of diverse knowledge systems, are inclusive of other worldviews and stewardship and conservation practices. And unfortunately, there weren't many. There definitely were none that addressed climate adaptation to sea level rise from a coastal Eastern tribal nation perspective. And so I submitted an article that has been published in Climate and Development that captures just sort of the precipice. It opens the door for us to start to have these conversations about what Indigenous climate adaptation frameworks could look like, and how we can better contribute to the larger climate adaptation conversation, both at a national scale within the United States and at an international scale through mechanisms like the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change. So the article link is here. It's open access, and so we will share that with you as well. So what does this mean? Again, you've heard this, so I won't go over too much, but through 2050, Rutgers University, Professor Kopp did a study in 2020, so just last December, and said that through 2050, we are likely looking at 0.7 to 2 feet of rise in the Delaware River Basin, regardless of emissions. Now, if we look beyond 2050, if we, again, so sea level rise is very much connected to our emissions. It's connected to the warming of the planet, and particularly ice sheets, melting of ice sheets, and that warming that is contributing to that. And so you've heard a lot about that earlier today. I won't go too much in, but according to COP's predictions and modeling, so predictions based on modeling, under moderate emissions, we would likely see a rise of 1.4 feet by 2050, 3.3 feet by 2100. Now, if we sort of are on the higher end, and so really aren't attacking our emissions and really trying to meet the targets set out in the Paris Climate Agreement, which a report just came out, I think this past week, which said that most nations under their reporting are not going to meet the targets, and therefore we will, really face significant climate impacts because of our lack of meeting those emission targets. And so right now I'm planning and I'm advising in the aspect that we are going to be in this high-end rise scenario. And that really is that we're going to see close to a 3-foot rise by 2050 and close to a 7-foot rise by 2100. And so what does that mean for us as human societies, also in responsibility and relationality with duties to sort of our more than human relations, and making sure that they are also okay in our planning efforts for adaptation. So we have to, address and be concerned with the ways in which that projected sea level rise could have increased flooding events for us. It could mean permanent inundation of our tribal coastal areas. We're also concerned about saltwater intrusion, particularly for groundwater. About 90% of tribal nations are operating on predominantly well water systems. So saltwater intrusion is really a concern for us. And when we think about adaptation, it's okay, how do we transition off of well water systems to public water systems, or how do we ensure that if we are going to be using well water systems, that we have the adequate technical capabilities to monitor those well water systems to ensure that they are safe for future drinking water consumption and use. And so saltwater intrusion is a high concern for tribes in the mid-Atlantic and broader Atlantic regions because of drinking water contamination. I think we're also concerned about drinking water contamination, both from a tribal perspective and from a larger, in the context of the Delaware Basin perspective, the saltwater intrusion and the impact that has on our river systems, particularly if you think about the Delaware River, the saltwater front, the way in which that has an impact on drinking water that is drawn directly from freshwater courses. So it's not only about groundwater, but it's also about surface water and the impacts that sea level rise will have on both. And in some areas is already having on both. And then for us as tribes, it's also about how do we protect our cultural resources. So what I like to also note for folks is we have been living in North America on this part of the world for thousands of years in our own creation stories since time immemorial. And so sea level rise is not something new to us. But the frequency and the rate at which it is currently occurring is what is very daunting. And in the past, when we have had to, deal with sea level rise, we had more mobility, more opportunities for our societies to move and to adapt and to stay within locations of cultural patrimony. That's not the case anymore, particularly when we think about the densely populated eastern seaboard of the United States. There are many issues around relocation and migration due to climate-induced extreme events, whether that be from sea level rise or storms, that are very concerning, not only for us as tribes, but should be for the larger American populace along the Eastern Atlantic. So again, as I said earlier, it led me into thinking, okay, well, these are our challenges, these are our problems. What are we doing about it? Where are the solutions? And so I started to look at adaptation frameworks, those put out by NOAA, by the Army Corps of Engineers, by the IPCC, by other international civil society organizations, environmental NGOs working in these spaces to say, okay, what are folks recommending when it comes to how do we adapt to rising sea level? And nothing was talking about underrepresented, marginalized communities, communities of color, indigenous communities. It was all very much pedantically centered from the consideration of a Western property law framework of and market capitalism. And there wasn't very much conversation about nature, about our more than human relations, about societies that have a unique cultural connection to terrestrial and marine environments. And so I started to say, okay, well, I can't be the only person out there that has noticed this. And I'm not. And there were a few scholars that I will point you to, and I would encourage you to read their work if you're interested in how to make sure that you are advancing equity, diversity, inclusion, justice in your adaptation and resiliency work. And they are Marino and Hardy, as well as a few other scholars that they have written with. But Marino in 2018 wrote and suggests that we have a concern around sea level rise adaptation frameworks that is called, and what she conceptualizes as, adaptation oppression, which really is to highlight Western scientific and cultural biases reflected in the limited adaptation options present in existing frameworks. So what I was noticing out in the world actually had a name for it. Someone had coined a concept, and it's called adaptation oppression. And really it's saying that, okay, we are centering the types of innovations and adaptation measures that we're creating only within one knowledge system. And it was predominantly, as Marino highlights, within a Western scientific and cultural bias. And what she's also pointing out in this adaptation oppression is we're stifling innovation because we're only utilizing one knowledge system to inform the types of measures that we can take to conserve and to be better stewards of our basin and of our environmental marine and terrestrial land and waterscapes. And so, Hardy and other authors in 2017 also underscored that this existing processes for developing response strategies to climate change are very colorblind, or what they would call colorblind adaptation planning. Really thinking that, oh, we all have the same experiences when it comes to adapting to climate change, so we can overlook racial inequality, we can overlook systemic racism in our environmental governance institutions, and it'll be okay because there's really just the science to it. There's just one scientific approach, and that's all we need to adapt to these changing extreme climatic events. And in reality, we know that it's much more than that. I think the past year of social justice movements has shown that our ability to adapt and to be resilient and to have justice in the world is much more than just putting forward one scientific planning measure or a few scientific planning measures from one scientific tradition. We really need to be more inclusive of diverse scientific traditions that exist not only within a particular region of the world, but globally when we start to think about the work of some of our international organizations like the IPCC. So what does this actually look like? What does this look like in practice? This was very conceptual up to this point. I want to show you some existing adaptation frameworks. This one that sort of shows retreat, accommodate, protect. You can kind of see in protect, there's sort of this allusion to hard structures, soft defenses, putting up seawalls, that type of thing. Accommodate, maybe putting homes onto stilts. Planned retreat is sort of moving away. So in this instance too, you kind of have this next one is accommodate, protect, engineered. This one does actually include one that says to engineer around nature and to create nature-based solutions. And then they also have an example of retreat. This last one though adds a new topic or a new theme area that is becoming more popular, unfortunately so, and that is to add attack, which is this idea of land reclamation and development, so building out. And it's not necessarily that there's something wrong behind this concept or this adaptation measure. None of the measures are wrong. But what I would have us consider in the frame of adaptation oppression and of colorblind adaptation planning, as Hardy and Marino show us, is that a lot of this language is also very militarized. It's very combative. It almost harkens a level of violence towards nature, when in reality, nature is just adapting to anthropogenic changes, to human-caused errors that are leading to these new climatic changes. And so to advance innovation in such a way that is militaristic and combative may not be the right approach, or we should consider whether it is. So again, these are sort of the adaptation measures that are generally circulated around when it comes to sea level rise. Well, here's what I put forward. the paper puts forward a new framework called the WAMPUM adaptation framework. It builds off of Indigenous science and knowledge. So in the same way that these other adaptation frameworks appeal to non-Indigenous communities, communities that really rely on a Western scientific tradition, are very ingrained with that. And there's nothing wrong with Western science. There's really, great scientific endeavors and findings that have come out of that tradition. But there are also really great scientific traditions within Indigenous communities, and scientific findings and innovations that exist in Indigenous communities that can also be highlighted in an adaptation framework. And so that's what we put together with the WAMPUM adaptation framework. It stands for Witness, Acknowledge, Mend, Protect, Unite, and Move. For those unfamiliar with WAMPUM, it's a item of cultural patrimony to many Indigenous nations along the Eastern Atlantic coast. It was actually one of the first currencies in the United States adapted from Indigenous peoples. It forms many of our diplomatic relations and treaty relationships with the United States and Canada through early treaty belts. And it is formed from quahog and whelk shells. So it shows our deep conservation and stewardship connection and responsibilities to our more than human relations that live in estuarine environments. So it is really indicative of the type of diplomatic relationship that we have to the ocean and to the water. And so that's why it really is the grounding feature of this adaptation framework. So in Witness, we say that we want to witness warnings from human and non-human relations and follow the patterns of the natural world. And an example of this is scholar Elizabeth James Perry. She's a Quinawampanoag, and she underscores that a critical aspect of SLR response for her tribal nation is noting that Indigenous knowledge is about careful, respectful observation and cooperation with natural systems for a sustainable future. Now, this is really important because if we think of that in contrast or comparatively to the types of adaptation measures that are put forward in the previous adaptation frameworks that I showed you of protect, accommodate, retreat, attack, those are the antithesis to an Indigenous approach to adaptation. And so although they may work in other places around the United States, they won't work for Indigenous communities. And so we needed to find something that was a good fit for the types of knowledge and language that we utilize when we think about conservation and adaptation in relation to our natural environment. And then we have acknowledge, which is acknowledge traditional teachings and restore cultural stewardship practices. And in this principle, we really highlight a lot of the conservation efforts and stewardship practices, traditional ecological knowledge that our tribal nations have, and really trying to reclaim those, rebuild those. Many of those practices were prohibited. Some of them are still prohibited through either colonial laws that are still on the books or historical laws that are still on the books in the United States to prohibit the practice of what were deemed at the time maybe religious practices by Indigenous nations, whether that be prescribed burnings, cultural burnings for forestry maintenance, or any type of shellfish type of aquaculture. Some of these practices were very much forbidden, and in some ways due to U.S. colonial laws, and in some ways still are through a really long legislative process that I don't have enough time to go over today, but definitely look to the paper for some additional depth and more writings for this project to come. But what we want to center here is that we have a rich traditional ecological knowledge in the region from Indigenous communities, and we should be tapping into that and reclaiming that to allow for more nature-based solutions to our adaptation frameworks. And this leads into the next principle of mend, which is mend the shoreline and practice healing for coastal and environmental sovereignty. So recognizing the rights of nature, and I'll speak to that as well towards the end of this talk, but as was highlighted earlier with my TED talk, we, within our Indigenous legal systems, acknowledge that nature has rights, has inherent rights. And within that, there are duties and responsibilities as human stewards and caretakers to acknowledge those rights and to fulfill responsibilities and relationality towards those rights. And a part of that is mending that relationship, and that's why it's included in the framework. And we've done that at Shinnecock. It included dealing with some of our shoreline erosion through nature-based solutions, including eelgrass planting, as well as doing some adding more sand as well as stone barriers to eliminate some of the storm surge that we were experiencing. So those are some examples of the mending shorelines, but there's so many more out there that we're hoping to collect through future iterations of this research. In the protect column, we're looking to protect future generations by protecting cultural sites and ancestors. And so in many instances, a lot of our tribal territories are already facing erosion that impacts infrastructure. So in the example that follows, it impacts infrastructure, but it also impacts our ceremonial sites. So the ability to maintain ceremonial practices at sites of cultural patrimony. It could also be grave sites. It also could be other sites of cultural resources. And so interestingly, as I mentioned earlier, we have a long history of dealing with sea level rise, and particularly along the Atlantic coast. And so we have new innovations that have been led in large part by the Narragansett tribe for underwater archaeology, and really trying to collect some baseline data, develop methodology through which we can protect submerged cultural resources now and into the future. And I think this is going to be, really important as we start to deal with more issues of sea level rise. In the Unite principle, we are uniting with other communities to build capacity and plan for relocation if that is what it may come to. And so I've been really fortunate to know and be involved in the work of the United South and Eastern Tribes. You said it's an intertribal organization, and I think that these types of water institutions, climate institutions that are intertribal and indigenous led are really helpful, because they are starting to allow for us to connect and share knowledge and build that global solidarity, at least at the tribal level that Secretary Ban Ki-moon spoke to earlier, that is needed when we're trying to create these really innovative solutions to adapt to climate change. The last principle is move. So eventually, at some point, we are likely, in the worst case scenario, are going to have to move. And there are many considerations that have to go into those decisions. Most significantly is that within the United States, we do not have enough legislation and regulation in place to provide mechanisms by which Indigenous or non-Indigenous are able to have the funds and the resources to relocate. And particularly in the context of Indigenous peoples, to be able to relocate to locations that are of significant cultural patrimony, matrimony, and connection, so that we are able to not only rebuild in a way that allows us to sustain our political, cultural, and spiritual existence for future generations, but allows us to do so with dignity. And that is something that should be at the forefront of everyone's minds when we think about what does climate migration look like between now and 2100. And for the Passamaquoddy tribe, their Pleasant Point Sipiak Reservation, this is something that they are already considering and trying to address. They've faced massive shoreline erosion that's impacting their water infrastructure, including a wastewater treatment plant. So again, this is just a highlight for you that this paper is somewhat conceptual in its design and introducing a new framework that may be helpful for some tribal nations, may not be, may be helpful for some non-Indigenous communities, may not be, but it's not to sort of conceptualize that what if when sea level rise happens. It's to show you this is already happening and that there are already innovations being led by Indigenous leadership around the region. And so I hope what you will take away from today is to find ways in which you can partner with Indigenous leadership, Indigenous organizations, tribal governments in the region, particularly in the Delaware Basin, and think about, how are you accounting for these cultural connections? How are you accounting for tribal uses? How are diverse voices and diverse knowledge systems, even outside of Indigenous peoples, being included in the work that you are doing on a daily basis. And I think that leads us to what might be some new tools for resiliency. So another area of my work, and I think it also lends itself to the conceptualization of the WAMPUM adaptation framework, is that in tapping into acknowledging our long storied history of traditional knowledge in the region under that acknowledge principle, we understand that water and that our more than human relations nature has inherent rights, as I mentioned earlier, and that we could be working together, both as Indigenous governments and non-Indigenous governments, to advocate for legal personhood for water or for other natural beings. And what that would entail would be the creation of legal enforcement mechanisms, co-governance arrangements, potentially the establishment of water guardians for the water. And it really allows for a more holistic approach than what we have previously been employing. And in large parts, maybe what we have been utilizing in previous decades has not been substantively leading to the transformative change we need to address our pressing environmental challenges. And so we're almost advocating in recognition of climate change, in recognition of our climate crisis, that we may now be at a stage where legal personhood and recognition of the inherent rights of nature is necessary for us to be able to adapt and build resilient communities that can really meet these new pressing challenges of our climate crisis. And we're seeing it already implemented in places around the world, from the Wanganui River in Aotearoa, New Zealand, to the Ganges in India. The Yurok tribe granted the Klamath River rights of recognition in 2019, as well as the city of Toledo for Lake Erie. Now, many of these rivers and lake and freshwater surface systems are being litigated and contested, which is unfortunate. But I do think they are starting to shift the conversation to really challenge all of us as water people, as folks that work for the protection of freshwater and estuary and ocean systems, to think about what is our future model of governance in these spaces look like. And maybe that could be, is the Delaware River next? Is the Delaware Bay next? There has not been an estuarine system that has been granted legal personhood. And so if this is your first entree to a conversation about legal personhood, rights of nature, the inherent rights of nature, earth law, I encourage you to watch my TED Talk, as was mentioned earlier. It gives you a pretty good, concise bite of what we are advocating for and fighting for. And ultimately, whether it's legal personhood or other new tools for resiliency, we are really saying, and I am saying, that what we have been doing hasn't been working. So let's think innovatively, creatively, so that we do have a shared sustainable future to pass down to our children and their children and their children's children. So with that, I'll turn it over to questions.
Go ahead, Kurt. Thank you, Kelsey.
All right.
That was wonderful, wonderful.
So Skelly has a question. Feel free to unmute.
Maybe not.
Oh, we maybe lost her. Anyone else, feel free to raise your hand. I can have you unmute.
I'll ask a question, I guess, then. Thanks, Kelsey. That was very good. Love the whole thing. Do you have any tips for us that may have not, haven't started working with the Indigenous people before, ways to make those first connections and things like that in the different work that we do?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. First, for a lot of folks, it might be orienting yourself to the nativeland.ca map, right? Because that might be your first introduction. Unfortunately, our education system has somewhat failed in a lot of ways in adequately preparing our environmental leaders to have a sufficient knowledge of Indigenous peoples, our governments, and the way in which we still exist in the region. And so a lot of, you might be feeling like you're playing a bit of catch up. So there's some, and you are in a lot of ways that it's not, you might be saying to yourself, no one ever told me this. Yeah, I hear that a lot. It is unfortunate, but now, now you cannot say that you do not know. So the responsibility and role, I think first steps are to educate yourself, to either through news articles and books and finding opportunities to engage in those types of conversations. And then you also can reach out to tribal governments, right? So once you start to do that research, you can reach out to tribal governments, to tribal organizations. I think as you are planning, particularly for data collection, for research, for scientific priority setting in any portion of the world, but particularly if we're thinking about the Delaware Basin, we should always be asking ourselves, have we reached out to the tribes or to the Indigenous organizations in the region to see if they would like to be a part of this project, this scientific endeavor, this research? Really, it's about positioning ourselves for knowledge co-mobilization or blended mobilization of diverse knowledge systems, Indigenous, non-Indigenous, other communities of color and marginalized communities to be involved in the work. And that's where I would start.
Thank you.
I think someone mentioned a question about a green amendment, and if they were thinking of a green amendment to the U.S. Constitution, that green amendments have worked in other instances around the world for different nation states and countries. Given our existing legislative process and the heightened level of polarization that we've seen in the United States in the past 10 years, I would be hesitant to see whether or not a green amendment would be effective. I think, transformation starts from initiating the conversation. So it would be good to see if we could get a green amendment, but I am less hopeful in that realm as opposed to it being more grassroots led, starting locally, working between municipalities, cities, states in conjunction with tribal governments and positioning it that way.
I have a question, Kelsey, while we're waiting on other questions to come in, but I'm really intrigued by, the part of WAMPUM that is related to MEND. One of the, I feel like there's convergent evolution going on, and maybe we're all converging on a Native American way of thinking about how we promote living in balance with nature. So for instance, PDE, we do a lot of work with living shorelines, and it really, all of our tactics are trying to read the flow of nature and to try to design for what is going to be sustainable, natural systems that we view almost as allies. These functional dominant plants and animals are providing ecosystem services, maybe structural support, maybe ecological functions that we depend on. But we're trying to really focus on what their needs are and how to engineer the habitat so that their needs are met, so that they give back, in this sort of mutualism. And I'm just curious if you could tell us a little bit more about, the traditional views on how we live in balance with nature, how we engineer projects or systems in that sort of way. It's like your point about, not viewing things in a militaristic, hard infrastructure kind of approach.
Yes, I think in a lot of ways, the hard infrastructure, the overly engineered solutions to sea level rise are probably the greatest areas of conflict or confrontation from an Eastern tribal nation standpoint for this portion of the world in the Atlantic, because that isn't something that is a part of our Indigenous laws, the types of relationships, responsibilities we conceive of to nature. It's not to sort of almost be combative against nature and to sort of take on these sort of violent practices of harm in building out or kind of attacking the land as is often phrased. And I think in large part, folks are now saying, okay, well, the alternative to that is nature-based solution. And I think, the indigenous people in the back of the room are like, hey, that's what we've been doing for 1,000 years. So it's not really, you haven't invented something new. We would just love for you to learn from us and to really work with us and partner with us, because we think that there are, great, as I mentioned earlier, great scientific findings that have come from, Western traditions and some of the biophysical sciences that have been conceived of from a Western scientific philosophy. But in coupled with some of our indigenous knowledge systems, the observational data that we have over generations, think about the level of best available data that we could be using to create and co-mobilize innovations to adapt. Really the potential is limitless. Right now, we're kind of limiting ourselves because we're siloing our knowledges and our practices. And also, I think when we think about justice movements, it is important to credit knowledge appropriately and to not appropriate. And so I think that that's a big part of what I'm noticing and why I wanted to position this work in the larger climate adaptation research, is to say nature-based solutions are great. Hey, we've been saying this for thousands of years, learn from us. We've been actually doing it for a lot longer. And hopefully we could work together to show you a bit of what we know.
Thank you.
I hope that answered your question.
No, it did. There's still some, I guess, follow-up questions like, okay, so what's the next step? If we want to tap into that indigenous knowledge and, bring it into our programming, it sort of gets to Sarah's question. We do have local, tribal connections, but I sense that there is a larger body of knowledge nationally or, across all the different nations.
So I would say, I think with that, what I also want to give as a caveat for everyone is that I have used the term indigenous knowledge in the same way that we would use indigenous knowledge and then indigenous science, in the same way that we would say Western knowledge and Western science. Now, under Western knowledge and Western science, there are so many other scientific disciplines and traditions that fall underneath that, in the same way that you would have for indigenous knowledge and indigenous science. So the caveat is, although I am using sort of more generalizable terms, when we think about, okay, how do we operationalize this locally, it is actually working directly with tribal nations, with tribal leadership, indigenous community organizations that are based physically in or have a connection to the terrestrial or marine environment that the research, science, adaptation efforts are occurring in. And that could be bringing them on as full partners from conceptualization to implementation of a research project or scientific data collection endeavor, or it could be having them as a part of a planning body, a planning board, being a part of writing and crafting and developing new adaptation frameworks. So there's a multitude and layers, I think, to how to operationalize this practice. But although there are generalizable terms, always go local. I think sometimes we want to look for the national expert on this and the national expert on this and the international expert on that, and the IPCC scientists, and they are fantastic. They're doing wonderful work, but they also come from local communities. That's why they get to the IPCC, because we're pulling all of the best and brightest from around the world. And I just want to really highlight to people that there are real people, real scientists, and also traditional knowledge holders that maybe just be fishermen and practitioners that have lived in the region for decades and generations that we should be tapping into as resources. It doesn't always need to have a PhD at the end.
For sure. Kurt, we have a couple minutes left. Do you have any other questions from folks?
Yeah, Joan has her hand raised, so feel free to unmute yourself.
Yes, I'm very much in harmony with the previous speaker that we do recognize. I really appreciate Indigenous people have recognized first. That's really the relationship. They look at the water not as just some matters for our purposes. It's really the relationship. It's like something living. And science data actually discovered that water actually does respond. There's something mysterious, and there's a data to cover it. And there are tons of other data to cover that nature does help our health. And then you just answered my question that, allow, engage indigenous people, with our presenting the climate change crisis. And I'm gonna just do that when I go before the board meeting. I'm a teacher at Trenton Public School. When I go before the board meeting, I'm gonna include some indigenous culture, and I'm looking up for indigenous culture in Delaware area, and I'm looking up for the history of Delaware in relationship with the indigenous culture. But what else can you recommend as far as, following the culture, the example left by the indigenous culture on how you view the nature, the animals, what you view them as relationship, not just something that we can use for our survival. You guys have different way of, the indigenous culture have different perspective as a relationship. What advice do you have for us to emulate that?
Well, one of the things, I don't know, what is the age range that you have for your students? Is it high school or elementary? Sorry, they might have gone off. Well, one of the programs that I would highlight is the junior water walkers. You can, 9th grade. Yeah, so it might still work. It's generally, junior water walkers are something that was started for elementary age students. But I think there's some good frameworks there. There are some lesson plans, but it's really about how do we restore that connection to water for students throughout the world. It is built off of indigenous knowledge shared by indigenous grandmothers and women who walked the Great Lakes and other water bodies around North America and other parts of the world. And so the Junior Water Walkers is a great reference point of how to build an academic program that responds to local indigenous knowledge, but also builds in other types of science lesson plans and really tries to work to transform how we're educating students about not only the biophysical components of water, but also our relationship responsibilities to water as a living entity. And so I think, a takeaway is that from an indigenous perspective, it is not that the biophysical components of water conservation are not important. They are wholeheartedly important, but they're one part of the story of a larger being. And so to understand that the entirety of that being, we need to also be educating children, be educating young scientists on the different facets of water governance and what makes up our responsibilities to water. And in large part, the Earth Law is an aspect that starts to meet some of those missing components. Outside of the biophysical, it's what does water need to flourish, thrive, naturally evolve, and exist without human interference.
Okay, great. Thank you again so much for joining us from Ontario, is it? You're in Ontario? Yep. And for tailoring your presentation to the Delaware. Thank you so much. It is just after 4:30, so it is the end of our program for the day 2 of the Delaware Estuary Science and Environmental Summit. Sarah's going to give us a few housekeeping notes, but before we do that, Sarah, I just want to do a virtual try to get my camera on, virtual applause. So imagine 100 people or 200 people applauding right now, Kelsey, if we were face to face. Thank you again.
Tabutni, thank you all so much. It was a pleasure. Great questions. And my email and Twitter are there if folks want to reach out to me with your questions. I may be able to get to them as well, but please keep in touch. And I'm so thrilled to have been able to be in conversation with you today.
Thanks. Lots of things for us to dwell on for a while and think about. Yep.
Yes, thank you so much, Kelsey. That was great. I'll just give my usual plugs here at the end. Please check out our sponsorship profiles. We could not do this without them. And also please check out our poster and pre-recorded sessions. That's the first thing tomorrow morning is our final poster session. And then also tonight for students, we have our mentor-mentee networking session where we have 10 different mentors who are willing to talk about pretty much anything, very casual, in small breakout rooms with different students and young professionals. There was a sign up ahead of time, but if you didn't sign up, you are still welcome to come for mentees and come chat with everyone, and that's at 5:30. So I hope to see you there and then see you tomorrow morning. Thank you. Oh, you're muted, Danielle.
Sorry, one more thing. Folks who are judging student presentations, Leah has just sent around a reminder to be sure to turn in your forms electronically through Google Form. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, bye.